It is June 16, 1943. A lone B-17 flying fortress hangs in the infinite blue expanse of the Pacific sky. Inside this aircraft are 10 men. They are 600 miles from home, suspended over an emerald jungle that wants to swallow them whole. Their fuel is burning low. Their oxygen is thinning. And appearing on the horizon, rising like a swarm of angry hornets from the Japanese airfields below, are 17 A6M0 fighters. The math is simple. It is cruel. It is impossible. One heavy bomber lumbering and slow against 17 of the most agile fighter planes ever built by the Imperial Japanese Navy. By all laws of aerial warfare, these men are already dead. They just haven't hit the ground yet. But the Japanese pilots climbing to meet them do not know what they are flying against. They see a standard B-17 flying fortress. They do not know that this specific plane was pulled from a garbage heap. They do not know it is flown by a renegade captain who wired a trigger to his own control yoke because he got tired of not being able to shoot back. And they certainly do not know that the plane they are hunting carries a tail number that the ground crews whisper about in fear. 412666. They call it Old 666, and today it is going to earn its name. To understand the miracle that happened over the island of Bougainville, we must first descend into the mud and misery of Port Moresby, New Guinea, in the spring of 1943. The war in the Southwest Pacific was a brutal, grinding stalemate. The United States 5th Air Force, commanded by General George Kenney, was fighting a war of attrition against the Empire of Japan. But their greatest enemy wasn't always the Japanese. It was New Guinea itself. This was a place where the humidity rotted leather boots off your feet in a week. Temperatures on the flight line frequently soared above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister skin if you touched the aluminum skin of an aircraft. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery took more men out of action than enemy bullets. It was a green hell, a place where machines and men went to rot. And sitting at the far end of the 7-mile airdrome, separated from the active flight line like a leper, was the boneyard. This was the graveyard of giants, the final resting place for B-17s and B-24s that had been chewed up by flak or twisted by hard landings. Resting in the tall, razor-sharp Kunai grass sat a Boeing B-17E flying fortress with the serial number 412666. It was a pariah, a hangar queen. From the moment it had arrived in the Pacific, this plane had been a curse. It had a reputation for attracting heavy flak on every mission, yet never delivering its bombs on target. The electrical systems shorted out constantly in the damp air. The engines ran hot. It was heavy on the controls, flying like a brick even by bomber standards. Superstitious ground crews looked at the 666 on the tail and refused to work on it. The pilots of the 43rd Bomb Group refused to fly it. So the Army Air Force did the only thing it could. They parked it in the weeds and began stripping it for parts to keep the other planes alive. But Captain J. Zeamer Jr. was not a man who cared much for superstition. Zeamer was a problem for the Army. He was a misfit. Born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and educated as a civil engineer at MIT, Zeamer approached warfare like a physics problem. He was brilliant, but he was chemically incapable of following rigid regulations. He slept through briefings. He wore his uniform in a state of perpetual disarray. He questioned orders he didn't agree with. By 1943, despite being one of the most naturally gifted pilots in the theater, Zeamer was unemployed. No squadron commander wanted him. He was stuck as an operations officer, flying a desk, watching other men take off to bomb Rabaul while he filed paperwork. It was killing him. He was desperate to get into the fight, but he had no crew and no plane. Then he saw the carcass of old 666 sitting in the boneyard. He walked out to the scrap heap with a man who would become the other half of this legend, Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski. If Zeamer was the brains, Sarnoski was the heart. A coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, Sarnoski was the Bombardier. He was quiet, tough as nails, and fiercely loyal. He was considered one of the best bombardiers in the Pacific, a shack master who could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. He could have flown with any lead crew in the Air Force, but he chose to fly with the outcast, Zeamer. Zeamer looked at the rusting hulk of old 666. He turned to the maintenance chief and asked a question that sounded like a joke. "If I can get that pile of junk flying, can I keep it?" The chief laughed. "Captain, if you can get that thing off the ground, it's all yours." Zeamer and Sarnoski went to work, but they couldn't do it alone. They needed a crew. Because Zeamer was a pariah, he couldn't just request men, he had to recruit them. He walked through the barracks looking for the other misfits, the guys who didn't fit in, the guys who were bored, the guys who were crazy enough to volunteer for a suicide squad. He found them. They called themselves the Eager Beavers. It was an ironic name, mocking their own eagerness to fly missions no one else wanted. They dragged old 666 out of the grass and began a resurrection. But Zeamer didn't just want to fix the plane. He wanted to change the way the B-17 fought. Zeamer had analyzed the combat reports. He knew that the B-17E had a fatal flaw. It was designed to fight in Europe, protecting itself from German fighters attacking from the rear. But the Japanese pilots were smart. They had developed the 12 o'clock high attack. They would fly straight at the nose of the bomber head-on. The B-17's nose armament was pathetic. A single, flexible .30 caliber machine gun that the Bombardier had to shove through a socket. It was a pea shooter against a 20 cannon. When a Zero came in head-on, the Bombardier was helpless, and the pilots were sitting ducks behind a sheet of glass. Zeamer decided to turn old 666 into a battleship. He and the Eager Beavers began scavenging. They went to the wreck of a B-26 Marauder and ripped out the heavy machine guns. They stole guns from supply depots. They stripped the weight out of the bomber to compensate for the steel they were about to add. Zeamer reinforced the floor of the nose with steel plates. Then they did the unthinkable. They mounted a twin .50 caliber machine gun turret in the chin of the plane, something that wouldn't become standard on B-17s until the G model much later. But Zeamer went further. He mounted a fixed .50 caliber machine gun to the side of the cockpit, wired to a button on his control yoke. He wanted to be able to aim the entire bomber like a fighter plane and kill anything that tried to attack him head-on. They added extra guns in the waist windows. They swapped single barrels for twin barrels. When they were finished, a standard B-17 carried 12 machine guns. Old 666 carried 19. It was the most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific Theater. It was a porcupine of .50 caliber death. By June 1943, the crew was ready. The plane was ready. And the American High Command had a problem that only a madman could solve. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Bougainville, a critical island in the Solomon chain. But the maps were blank. They had no data on the reefs, the beaches, or the enemy fortifications. They needed a faux reconnaissance mission. But Bougainville was a fortress. It was guarded by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and two massive Japanese airfields, Buka and Kahili. To map the island, a plane would have to fly straight and level alone for 20 minutes in broad daylight right over the hornet's nest. It was a suicide mission. Every squadron commander turned it down. You couldn't send a lone bomber 600 miles into enemy territory without a fighter escort. Zeamer heard about the mission. He looked at Sarnoski. Sarnoski nodded. Zeamer walked into the operations tent, pointed at the map, and said 3 words that sealed their fate. "We'll take it." The date was set for June 16. The Eager Beavers loaded their cameras and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to fly into history. The physics of a head-on aerial attack are terrifying. A B-17 flying fortress cruises at roughly 180 miles per hour. A Mitsubishi Zero dives at nearly 350 miles per hour. That means the two aircraft are closing the distance between them at over 500 miles per hour. At that speed, human reflexes are barely fast enough to pull a trigger. You don't aim at the plane. You aim at the empty space where the plane is going to be in a fraction of a second. Captain Zeamer held the bomber steady. He couldn't jink. He couldn't turn. The mapping camera in the belly was still running, and if he banked the wings even 5 degrees, the photos would be blurry and the mission would fail. He had to fly straight into the teeth of the attack. The lead flight of 5 Zeros organized themselves into a V formation. They had seen B-17s before. They knew the nose was the weak spot. They planned to slash through the front of the bomber, putting 20 cannon shells directly into the pilots' faces. In the nose cone, Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski watched them come. Usually, a bombardier would be terrified. He was sitting behind a sheet of plexiglass with no armor protection. But Sarnoski wasn't holding a single flexible gun anymore. He was gripping the spade grips of the twin .50 caliber machine guns he and Zeamer had bolted to the floor. At 10:20 a.m., the lead Zero opened fire. White puffs of smoke erupted from the Japanese wings. Tracers zipped past the cockpit like angry fireflies. Sarnoski waited. He let the enemy get close. 700 yards, 500 yards, 400 yards. Then he unleashed hell. The twin .50s roared. The nose of the bomber filled with the smell of cordite. A stream of armor-piercing incendiary bullets slammed into the lead Zero. The Japanese pilot never knew what hit him. He expected a weak defense. Instead, he flew into a wall of lead. His plane disintegrated in midair, the wings shearing off as the fuel tanks exploded. Zeamer, sitting in the cockpit, pressed the button on his control yoke. The fixed gun mounted on the side of the fuselage joined the chorus. Old 666 wasn't a victim. It was a porcupine of fire. The Japanese formation broke. They were shocked. They had never seen a bomber fight like this. But they were elite pilots. They regrouped instantly and came back for a second pass. And this time they didn't miss. The second wave of Zeros learned from the mistake of the first. They came in steeper, attacking from slightly above to avoid Sarnoski's fire. A 20 cannon shell, an explosive projectile the size of a large carrot, smashed through the plexiglass nose of the B-17. It didn't pass through. It exploded inside the nose compartment. The blast was catastrophic. It threw Joseph Sarnoski backward off his seat and slammed him into the catwalk beneath the cockpit. The shrapnel ripped open his stomach. He was mortally wounded, his body riddled with metal, bleeding profusely onto the cold aluminum floor. The blast wave traveled upward into the cockpit. It shredded the instrument panel. Glass and metal flew everywhere. Captain J. Zeamer felt a sledgehammer blow to his lower body. The explosion had ripped through the rudder pedals and destroyed his legs. The cockpit became a nightmare. The wind was screaming through the shattered windshield at 200 miles per hour, deafening the crew. The temperature instantly dropped to sub-zero. Blood, Sarnoski's and Zeamer's sprayed across the controls, freezing instantly in the high-altitude air. The hydraulic system was severed. Fluid leaked onto the floor, mixing with the blood. Zeamer looked down. His legs were mangled. He tried to move his feet to work the rudder pedals, but there was no response. The control cables were severed. He was bleeding out. He was losing consciousness. The plane began to dip, the nose dropping toward the ocean below. If he passed out, the plane would enter a death spiral. The centrifugal force would pin the crew to the walls, making it impossible to bail out. They would all die. Zeamer gritted his teeth. He grabbed the control column with white-knuckled hands. He forced his brain to stay awake through the pain. Since he couldn't use the rudder, he started manipulating the engine throttles, revving the left engines to turn right, revving the right engines to turn left. He was flying a 30-ton bomber with his fingertips and sheer willpower. But in the nose, something even more miraculous was happening. Joseph Sarnoski should have been dead. The explosion had eviscerated him. He was lying in a pool of his own blood in the catwalk. The navigator, Lieutenant Ruby Johnston, crawled forward to help him. "Joe," Johnston screamed over the wind, "I'm going to give you morphine." Sarnoski pushed the needle away. He shook his head. He knew that if he took the morphine, he would pass out, and he could see something Johnston couldn't. Through the shattered nose glass, a third Japanese Zero was lining up for a kill shot. It was coming straight for the cockpit, aiming to finish off the pilot. Sarnoski dragged himself across the floor. He left a trail of blood on the metal. He pulled himself up to the twin guns. His hands were shaking. He was growing cold as the life drained out of him, but he grabbed the handles. He waited. The Zero grew larger in the sights. Sarnoski pulled the trigger. The burst was accurate. The rounds smashed into the Zero's engine block. The Japanese plane caught fire, rolled over, and plummeted into the jungle below. Sarnoski slumped over his guns. He had shot down 2 fighters. He had saved the ship. He looked back at Johnston, weak and pale. He whispered something that Johnston could barely hear over the roar of the engines. "I'm all right. Don't worry about me." Then he collapsed. Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski died at his post, defending his friends until his heart stopped beating. But the battle wasn't over. It had only been 5 minutes. There were still 15 Zeros left, and they were angry. For the next 45 minutes, Old 666 became the center of a swirling dogfight that spanned hundreds of miles of sky. Usually an aerial battle lasts seconds. Planes make a pass, fire, and zoom away. This was different. This was a siege. The Japanese pilots swarmed the crippled bomber like sharks. They attacked from the tail. They attacked from the beam. They attacked from above. But everywhere they turned, they met fire. Zeamer's modifications were paying off. When a Zero tried to attack from the side, the waist gunners, Pudgy Pug and the others, opened up with their extra guns. When they tried to attack from below, the ball turret gunner tracked them. Zeamer, fighting the darkness closing in on his vision, refused to take evasive action. "Hold her steady," he rasped over the intercom. "Finish the photos." Only when the camera finally clicked its last frame did Zeamer turn the plane. He banked hard toward the sea, diving to pick up speed. The Zeros chased them. They knew the bomber was hurt. They could see the smoke trailing from the engines. They could see the holes in the fuselage, but they couldn't kill it. Old 666 took a beating that defied engineering. Bullets severed the oxygen lines. The crew had to share emergency, walk-around bottles, passing them back and forth between firing bursts at the enemy. A shell hit the radio compartment, starting a small fire that the crew stomped out with their boots. The elevator cables were frayed to a single strand. Finally, low on fuel and ammunition, the Japanese squadron commander signaled his men to break off. They had hit the American bomber with everything they had. They assumed it would crash into the sea within minutes. They turned back to Bougainville. Old 666 was alone again, but they were still 500 miles from home. The silence that followed the battle was worse than the noise. The adrenaline faded, and the pain set in. In the cockpit, Zeamer was barely conscious. He had lost a lethal amount of blood. His flight suit was stiff with gore. The co-pilot tried to take the controls, but Zeamer refused. He knew the plane better than anyone. He knew that with the hydraulic system gone, the brakes wouldn't work. Landing was going to be a controlled crash. He had to stay awake. "Talk to me," he told the co-pilot. "Keep me talking." For 3 hours, Zeamer flew on instinct. He navigated over the Owen Stanley Mountains, threading the needle through the peaks. When they finally saw the airstrip at Port Moresby, the sun was high in the sky. Zeamer called the tower. His voice was a whisper. "Emergency landing, no brakes, wounded on board." He lined up the runway. He cut the engines. Old 666 hit the ground fast. Without brakes, it screamed down the tarmac, skidding sideways. It finally ground to a halt at the very end of the strip, dust billowing around the battered fuselage. The ground crews rushed out. They had never seen a plane in this condition. They counted 187 bullet holes. There were 5 gaping holes from 20 cannon shells. The vertical stabilizer was almost completely shot away. The medics pulled Sarnoski's body from the nose. They pulled Zeamer from the cockpit. He had passed out the moment the plane stopped moving. They rushed him to the field hospital. The doctors took one look at his legs and shook their heads. They didn't think he would survive the night. He had 120 pieces of shrapnel in his body. He had lost 50% of his blood volume. But Zeamer was stubborn. He survived the night, then the next. He spent months in the hospital. He would never walk properly again, but he lived. The photos from the camera were developed. They were perfect. Using the intelligence from old 666, the Allies launched the invasion of Bougainville. They knew exactly where the reefs were. They knew where the guns were. Thousands of American lives were saved because Sarnoski and Zeamer refused to turn back. When the engines finally stopped cooling on that airstrip in New Guinea, a heavy silence fell over the 43rd Bomb Group. We often look at war through the lens of statistics. We count the planes shot down, we count the medals awarded, we count the miles flown. But statistics are cold. They cannot measure the weight of an empty bunk in a barracks. Joseph Sarnoski was gone. The man who had believed in Zeamer when no one else would. The man who crawled through his own blood to fire the final burst that saved the crew, was never coming home to Pennsylvania. For Zeamer, the war didn't end on the tarmac. It continued in a hospital bed. He spent 15 months fighting to save his legs. He endured agonizing surgeries, fighting infections that threatened to kill him long after the Japanese bullets had stopped flying. On January 16, 1944, a general walked into that hospital room. He stood beside Zeamer's bed. He held a small box containing a blue ribbon and a gold star, the Medal of Honor. Zeamer couldn't stand to receive it. He couldn't salute. He simply lay there, a broken man who had achieved the impossible, holding the medal that belonged just as much to the ghost of his best friend as it did to him. It is a stark reminder that glory in war is not like glory in the movies. There is no swelling orchestra. There is no perfect speech. There is only the quiet, dull ache of loss and the metal trinkets we give to survivors to try and make sense of the madness. But there is a deeper question here. Why them? Why did this specific crew, the eager Beavers, succeed where everyone else said failure was guaranteed? History often focuses on the perfect soldiers, the ones who shine their boots, salute sharply, and follow every order. But the story of old 666 teaches us something different. It teaches us the value of the misfit. Zeamer was a rebel. He was disorganized. He was messy. By the standards of a peacetime army, he was a terrible officer, but war is not peacetime. When the world falls apart, you don't need the man who follows the rule book. You need the man who throws the rule book away and builds a machine gun turret out of scrap metal. You need the man who looks at a cursed plane in a junkyard and sees a weapon. The crew of old 666 were not the best and brightest on paper. They were the cast-offs. They were the ones left behind in the draft. And yet, when the moment of truth arrived, they functioned as a single, perfect organism. This is the paradox of combat. It strips away the superficial layers of society. It doesn't care about your rank, your background, or your reputation. It only cares about one thing. When the fire starts, will you stand? The eager Beavers proved that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about looking at the impossible odds, looking at the friends beside you, and deciding that you are going to be the one who holds the line. And what of the machine itself? What of old 666? In the history of aviation, we remember the famous planes. We remember the Enola Gay. We remember the Memphis Belle. But old 666 has largely faded into the mists of history. It was never put in a museum. It was never toured around the country to sell war bonds. It was too damaged. It was too broken. Like many of the men who flew it, it was used up by the war and discarded. But in a way, that makes its story even more powerful. Old 666 represents the ultimate underdog story. It was a machine that had been given up for dead. It was a lemon, a curse. But metal has no soul. A machine is only as good as the men inside it. Zeamer and Sarnoski took a broken thing and filled it with their own spirit. They took a curse and turned it into a legend. It reminds us that nothing is truly lost until we give up on it. Whether it is a rusting bomber in a field of kunai grass or a human being broken by the trauma of war, there is always a chance for redemption. There is always a chance to rise one last time. The 187 bullet holes in that fuselage were not just damage. They were a testament. They were the scars of a plane that refused to let its crew die. As we look back on this story from the comfort of the 21st century, it is easy to view it as just an action movie. We hear the machine guns. We see the Zeros falling. It excites us. But we must never forget the most important word in this entire story: volunteer. Nobody ordered Zeamer to fly that mission. Nobody ordered Joe Sarnoski to get into that nose cone. Nobody ordered the gunners to board that plane. They could have said no, they could have flown a safer mission, they could have waited for an escort, but they stepped forward. Why? Why does a human being volunteer to walk into fire? It wasn't for hate. They didn't hate the Japanese pilots they had never met. And it wasn't for glory. They knew the odds were that they would die in a ball of flame over the ocean, unknown and unmourned. They did it for the photos. They did it for the map. Because they knew that in a few weeks, thousands of Marines were going to storm the beaches of Bougainville. And if those Marines didn't know where the reefs were, they would drown. If they didn't know where the guns were, they would be slaughtered. Zeamer and Sarnoski traded their safety for the safety of men they would never meet. They traded their blood for a piece of film. That is the definition of love. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The story of Old 666 is more than a war story. It is a mirror. It challenges us. We live in a world that encourages us to be safe. We are told to look out for number one. We are told to avoid risk, to seek comfort, to conform. Zeamer and Joe Sarnoski tell us a different story. They tell us that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. They tell us that one person with enough determination and enough duct tape can defy an empire. They tell us that loyalty is stronger than fear. We may never sit in the cockpit of a B-17. We may never face 17 fighter planes. But we all face our own battles. We all face moments where the odds are stacked against us. We all face moments where we have to decide whether to run away or to stand and fight. When those moments come, we should remember the eager Beavers. We should remember the pilot with the broken legs who wouldn't let go of the wheel. We should remember the Bombardier who died at his post so his friends could live. We are the inheritors of their sacrifice. The world we live in today, the freedom we enjoy, was bought with the blood of men like Joseph Sarnoski. The least we can do is remember their names. Zeamer, Joseph Sarnoski, Old 666. They were the impossible odds, and they won. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below with the words, "Never forgotten," to honor the crew of Old 666. This was just one chapter in the vast history of the Second World War. Join us next time on WWII Records as we uncover more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the human spirit. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a briefing. Dismissed.